When I read this book as a younger man, I had no idea how much it would affect me, but with its deep themes about Catholicism, sexuality, war, and English society, I'm not surprised that this is a book that I still think about today. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Read Good, Draw Bad, where we love to read really good and draw pretty darn bad. Today we're going to be reading what I consider to be one of the best books in the English language, at least for the 20th century, and I will fight you if you don't think so too. We are going to be reading the book Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. Evelyn Waugh is a masterful writer that I think we can learn a lot from if you've ever gone to university, fell in love, and felt sexually repressed, which I'm sure has never happened to anyone. Just so you know, I'm doing a reading challenge where I'm reading the top 100 novels of the 20th century as decided by the Modern Library. You can find more information in the description below. First, a TLDR on this book. This book was published in 1945, shortly after World War II. Brideshead Revisited is narrated by the main character Charles Ryder, and we follow Charles as he goes through the various phases of his life from university onwards until he is an older adult serving in World War II as a captain of a regiment. First, we start in the prologue, which is at the end of World War II, where he is, at the start of the book, revisiting Brideshead. And as a reader, we start to wonder, how did someone who's a jaded soldier end up at a fancy English manor at the end of a war? With our main character, Captain Charles Ryder, who is in charge of a group of soldiers who is staying at Brideshead as a refuge during World War II. And we learned that Captain Charles Ryder has been to Brideshead many times before, and it was a very important part of his life as a young man. And of course, we as readers start to wonder, how did this jaded soldier who seems to care about very little end up in this fancy, old, abandoned English manor? So we flash back to his very deep relationship he had with this very impressive building that used to belong to his close family friends, the Flight family, and the beautiful and haunting memories and the tragic separation between him and his family as various relationships fell apart. And so begins his memoir into his memory of all the memories that are elicited of him going through Brideshead as an adult at a time when it's been abandoned by the family that he used to care about so much. The next section of the book is called Et in Arcadia Ego, which means even in Arcadia, here am I. And Arcadia in this case means heaven. We follow Charles as he starts his career as a poor student, and then also eventually as a budding painter, which back then was like a very legitimate career for sort of a well-to-do noble child. He's befriended by Sebastian Flight, a very gay homosexual, and Charles is instantly drawn to him. And I would even argue that Charles and Sebastian have a soulmate-like relationship throughout this book, where they truly love, care, and respect for each other, as well as a deep, close friendship. And their deep friendship is something we'll discuss a little later in the book, but what's important to note here is that Charles notices that Sebastian and his family are deeply Roman Catholic, very religious, and this is something that also will be important later in the book. Basically, it's just important to note that in this time period, just like certain cultures or certain places in the world, the Roman Catholic Church really ruled the family rules that mattered to Sebastian's family. Now, Charles and Sebastian get up to all sorts of regular university-level shenanigans, like pretending they know wine, or putting rose petals around and addressing them with skulls and deciding that that's like really good decor, very gothic, very in, gives very Lord Jim vibes. But the foreshadowing as they're out drinking and cohorting around and having a good time, the foreshadowing is Sebastian talking about how deeply he hates his mother and how horrible he feels about the rules he feels he needs to follow based on aristocracy, on his family's legacy, and on the rules set by the Catholic Church. He also mentions how he's tormented by his older brother Bridie, who's a stuck-up dingus, and even by his sister Julia, who is someone who looks almost exactly like Sebastian, which will cause a lot of very unexpected and confusing sexual feelings for Charles later in the book. Now, during the study break, we briefly meet Charles's father, who I found to be the funniest character in this book, and teaching him how to manage his money as well as how to be a responsible adult, which of course Charles hates with a passion. Now, in order to escape boredom and doing taxes with his dad, Charles eventually gets himself invited to the family home of Sebastian. And there he meets the incredibly beautiful, charismatic, and enigmatic Lady Marchmain. Over time, Charles learns about the family's secrets. One of the biggest sort of open secrets is that Lord Marchmain ran away with a mistress to Italy a long time ago. And unfortunately, because in the Catholic Church they don't believe in divorce, instead they just keep it a dirty open secret that Lord Marchmain has ran away with his mistress, and Lady Marchmain hopes one day he'll return back to their marriage, and then everything can be fine again, which is about as messed up as you think it is. And while having a mistress that people know about is a scandal, being Catholic and part of this aristocracy and getting divorced is an even bigger scandal. And it's an even bigger deal because the family itself is in the public eye. Also important to note that Lord Marchmain, who flew away with his mistress to Italy, is actually a converted Anglican, so he's not naturally a Roman Catholic. And again, back then during this time period, being Anglican or being Catholic was a line in which you drew the sand for both your friends, your social circles, and the class of people that you ran with, and could matter to you both politically and professionally. Just keep it in mind that during this time period, not all is friendly between people who are Roman Catholic and people who are Anglican. As Charles spends more and more time with the Flight family, he finds himself becoming drawn to Julia as well as Lady Marchmain. Of course, because Sebastian hates most of his family, this ends up estranging Charles from Sebastian, because he can no longer rely on Charles to be a refuge from his family, since he starts to be basically on the other people's side, and in this case, when you have an aristocratic family, you have to pick sides, because there's always little subterfuges going on. And that's a big part of this book, of sort of the unspoken rules and wars that various characters are having with each other. Because to Sebastian, his whole family is his enemy, but because of the rules of the aristocracy, the Catholic Church, and the social pressures put upon him, he can't simply run away from them forever. Now, after this break, they go back to university and things have changed. Sebastian has become slightly more unhinged and is drinking more and more, and Charles is starting to expand his social circle. Charles ends up meeting another homosexual called Anthony, who hits on him regularly, but Charles says, actually, I'm just friends with Sebastian and leave me alone. And as Charles decides that he wants to spend more and more time with the people at Brideshead, this alienates him more and more from Sebastian. Because as you spend time with someone's family, people will tell you, oh yeah, so-and-so was always like this, so-and-so was always a problem. And Charles starts to believe that Sebastian was always a problem, which, as you can imagine, really strained their friendship. But things are brought to a head where Sebastian's drinking becomes so bad that Lady Marchmain forces him to go live with a Catholic priest and sober up. And this desire to control Sebastian is just so unforgivable to Charles that he ends up having a break and taking a break from the whole Flight family entirely. And as he decides to distance himself from the Flight family, this is when he decides he is going to decide his profession. And so he goes back to his father and discusses with him that he is professionally going to take up painting, which he thinks will become his official career. And this is the end of the first part of this book. The second part of this book, Brideshead Deserted, is a slow descent of moral and financial ruin for the Flight family. Like many aristocratic families of this time, they are slowly losing both their moral high ground to the changing times, and financially they are losing money over holding large estates, where normally large estates are no longer in fashion. But like most aristocratic families, they can't just get out of this situation easily or get a job or do other things that maybe normal middle class or poorer people might do. So to ease some of their financial burdens, Lady Julia ends up getting married to the Canadian businessman Rex Mottram. And I think his last name is so stupid, but that's his name. Now, everyone was very happy that Rex was getting married until, oops, Lady Marchmain finds out that Rex has an ex-wife, which is a huge no-no if you're going to marry into the Catholic Church, because you're only supposed to be married once and never divorce. And for obvious reasons, this caused a lot of pain to a lot of people back in the 1900s and I'm sure into the 1800s. So against her mother's wishes, Julia marries Rex in a small Protestant chapel, and that was something you simply did not do when you were a big aristocratic family like that. It would be like the equivalent of Kim Kardashian getting married in McDonald's. Now, Julia is still in contact with Charles from time to time, and as they grow older, Lady Marchmain falls sick. And Julia asks Charles to go find Sebastian to ask Sebastian to come back and see Lady M one time before she passes away. So Charles goes and eventually finds Sebastian in a monastery in Morocco, which at the time I thought, and I still think, is like a very weird place. Like, how did you end up in Morocco from England? It's just such a wild turn. Now, when Charles finds Sebastian, Sebastian is really, really sick because alcoholism has basically ruined his life. And he tells Charles he doesn't want to, nor will he travel, because, as is clear throughout the rest of the book, he basically hates his mom. Now, near the end of this section of the book, Charles is officially commissioned to paint the London Marchmain house, which is due for demolition due to the falling financial fortunes of the Flite family. Because, just to be clear, there's like 1 billion houses that they own because why wouldn't they have lots of houses? They're rich people. And this commissioning from the Flite family, basically from Lady Marchmain, leads to Charles becoming a very successful architectural painter. And then now we experience a small gap in time where he is now a success. We're now in the next part of the book, The Twitch Upon the Thread, which for me is both the wildest part of this book and with twists that I absolutely did not see coming, and I think is such a well-written piece of fiction. Here we join Charles years later, and he is married unhappily to a woman who he knows is cheating on him. And he still keeps in touch with Julia, who he knows is unhappy with Rex, because Rex is cheating on her. No one seems to be able to be happy in this book, but no one can get together with anyone else, because nobody is allowed to get divorced in this book. It's a real conundrum. And also, if you're high profile enough like Charles and Julia are, if you decide to start getting together, people are going to talk, which is exactly what happens later in this book. Charles and Julia end up on a boat voyage together and decide that, you know what? We don't need anybody. We have love and each other. And so in the public eye, now they are both considered kind of outcasts. Julia is now a double outcast for getting married in a Protestant church and then shacking up with some painter guy. And hilariously, at this point, we come back and find out what Bridie is doing, the older brother, and the answer is nothing. Now, as their love continues, the threat of World War II and the threat of Hitler rears its ugly head in the direction of England. There is a beautiful part in the book where Julia starts to express how she feels the past and the future are pressing in on the present, and she feels she can't live in the present moment. And I'm sure that's sort of the fear and the dread that a lot of people felt about the upcoming war and how it was an unstoppable force that they couldn't enjoy their life currently because of what was about to happen or what was happening. Now, surprisingly, out of nowhere, we turn to Lord Marchmain, who has been nowhere in this book up until this moment, other than as a passing thought. Because Lord Marchmain has had a great time being with his mistress in Italy, but now he's really sick, so he's coming home to die at Brideshead. And the way he decides to do this is by asking Charles, the family friend, to paint him dying and call the painting The Deathbed. Which is just completely unhinged rich people behavior, but I mean, maybe I would do it if that was me. I don't know. Charles agrees to do this and then ends up spending more time than expected with the Flite family. Because someone is dying in this book, and one of the themes is about religion, we have to talk about religious customs. Now, when someone who is Catholic is really sick and might pass away, that is when a priest will come and give them their last rites, which is supposed to help them get to heaven before they die. Bridie, who's a staunch Catholic, keeps going on and on about how his father needs last rites. However, Lord Marchmain won't hear anything about it because he says he's lived a good life, but also he knows what he's done in his life and doesn't want to apologize to anyone. He wants to be true to himself. And also Lord Marchmain is a hilarious character in this book But unfortunately, because he's dying, he's also terrified. And so in the end, in a moment that feels very strange, he relents and decides to get his last rites as a Catholic, even though he really is, for the most part, an Anglican who converted to Catholicism just so that he could marry Lady Marchmain. And this scene of him getting his last rites and his change of heart and conversion really affects Julia in such a way that she has kind of a spiritual conversion of her own. She feels very seriously that all the men that have been brought into her life, she's treated badly, and the best way to atone for this is for her to basically just become sort of like a nun. And so unfortunately, that means that she's going to stop her illicit relationship with Charles, because remember, no one's allowed to get divorced in this book, so they were just shacking up. She ends up inheriting Brideshead instead of Bridie, the oldest, who would normally go to, because Bridie is a twat and nobody likes him, including his father and mother. And in reality, there's a talk amongst the family where part of the reason Julia is getting Brideshead is because she really loved Brideshead for what it was, whereas Bridie was just waiting around for his inheritance. And like, everybody knew it. This part of the book ends with Julia saying she can't be with Charles and she'll always miss him, and Charles saying, this is probably going to be the last happy moment of my life, but I'll treasure it. And all I can do is really soldier on. And soldier on he does, right into World War II. We come to the masterful conclusion of this book, which is what happened to Brideshead in World War II, and what happened to Charles and the Flight family. So we are in the epilogue, which is like the prologue, back to where we began. We're back to where the book started, but we have all the information now we need to understand why things happened the way they did. Because Charles is finally at that moment of Brideshead Revisited. We are revisiting Brideshead with him after all of the major events of the book have taken place. The family that owned it has left, and they're renting it out to the military, probably for the money problems that the family now has. And Julia has turned into sort of an echo of her mother and become a deeply religious person. Now at the end of the book, there was an area of Brideshead that was closed off, and this area was the chapel. And this part of the chapel has been closed off since Lady Marchmain's death because it was special and important to her, amongst other reasons. Now that it has been reopened, instead of Lady Marchmain or the Flight family there, it is soldiers praying for the safety of themselves and their loved one during this horrible war. And Charles gets sort of a vision, sort of a spiritual moment of what he thinks God's plan was for all of this and for him, and what all of this was supposed to mean at the end of a moment where he feels very jaded, like every moment from now will not be a great moment. And Charles gets sort of a view of what he feels like the culmination of all the failures of his attempts at loving people in his life, and why he was not successful, and how these people that he loved so deeply, they're all now estranged from him or passed away, and leaves him with like a deep feeling of melancholy, and yet he's still there in front of the chapel hoping that there's a God that cares about him. And he gets this kind of very spiritual experience. I wouldn't even call it religious, I would call it a very spiritual, almost mystical experience of what he sees sort of on the altar, the ruins of this castle, of his failures, of a life of love. It's very poetic, but also like very sad. Now, thematically, this book is about a few things. One of these things, which is about Catholicism and sexuality and the tension therein. All of these characters, whether they're gay, straight, something else, all of the characters in this book struggle with their sexual urges and how to be proper in society while also having some form of romantic love. Because it's really hard to manage your side chick, your marriage, and all the pressures that society puts on you. Catholicism gives many rules, and many of the characters spend most of the time in this book trying to escape many of those rules, as they feel they are suffering under various social and religious pressures that make it really hard for them to live authentically the way they want. One example is that Lord Marchmain reconciles with the Catholic Church and with his last rites, even though he was an adulterer for the entirety of the book. Many gay male characters are flying under the radar in this book, like Sebastian or Anthony, and they are clearly in conflict with the rules of the Catholic Church, which means they could not be openly gay, but it was kind of an open secret at this point. Or it must have been, because Evelyn Waugh is writing about it, and this book is in 1945, people. Because homosexuality, open homosexuality, was very much frowned upon during this time, but people still kept it under the radar. It still existed, even though people pretended like it didn't. Now, this book also is about spirituality and reconciliation. Lady Marchmain is constantly trying to reconcile and make up with Sebastian. Julia is constantly trying to renegotiate her relationship with Catholicism after she gets married in a Protestant church. And I would argue that Charles goes from someone who's perhaps a university agnostic type of character who doesn't think much about spirituality to someone who's sort of been ruined by the various loves and failures in his life, but comes out with his soul intact at the end. Lastly, I think another important theme is the theme of time and the sunset era of the British Empire. In this book, we see a family which should have lived happily and well within their financial means throughout the entire book, but because of the upcoming war and perhaps some bad decisions, financial decisions, based on this family, they end up falling into, for the most part, financial ruin. In reality, a large manor like this, people who are aristocrats with great connections and money should have been able to avoid the effects of World War II, and yet they end up being a housing area for part of the army during World War II. And through Charles' painting, we see that part of what he's doing is capture a part of the past that will never come again, which is these beautiful architectural buildings that are eventually torn down or are ghost towns because aristocratic families are no longer the norm. There are new people who are making money in this world post-World War II who are going to survive and thrive more than the aristocracy in Britain. And this piece about memory, painting, time, and just the time frame right before and right after World War II is so much emblematic of how important memory is and how it serves us going forward during big events where we're very affected by them. Very interesting stuff. Now, on to the review. This book, it bears repeating, was published in 1945, right after World War II. I think this is one of the best books of this time period and one of the best books around World War II in general. Because I think this is one of the best English authors you can read where it talks about the relationship between high society as well as World War II, as well as the British Empire, and all of the various institutions that are caught up in various threads that make up what we think are kind of the top level of a society. Because without talking about World War II or being in the trenches or various parts about the war, there feels like a lot of failure, hopelessness, and a sense of dread that follows various characters throughout this book. Even though this book is not a sad book, in my opinion. People start to say, we've lost so much and we've gained so little. What was the point of all this war? What was it good for? And in the same way, Charles has a similar feeling when him and Julia break up, because at the end of their relationship, he says, I will just continue on. Even if there's no happiness, I'm just going to have to figure out how to keep going in life. And I feel a lot of people in World War II shared that sentiment. And all these feelings are expressed very beautifully in the opening of the prologue. Let me read you some of the opening lines of the prologue where you can get a sense of the feelings that Charles had about this building and about this place and what it meant to him. As he recalls his time at Brideshead while he's wrapping up sort of his time with C Company, the military. I had reflected then that whatever scenes of desolation lay ahead of us, I reflected now that it had no single happy memory for me. Here, love had died between me and the army. Here, at the age 39, I had begun to be old. Here, my last love died. I had been there forever, first with Sebastian more than 20 years ago on a cloudless day in June. That day, too, I had not come knowing my destination. And so this book is such a long love letter to memory and the memories of things we cherish and care about. And even though not everything's brought ahead, the characters are deep and funny and interesting and have a level of depth to them that you would not expect for a book about the upper middle class or the aristocracy. And even though we can feel the incredible loneliness and the sadness in both the opening and closing of this book, I would not call this book a sad book. The main reason I think this book is so hopeful is because it shows real human relationships with all their ups and downs and where they start and where they end. With Sebastian and Charles, it ends with Sebastian going into a deep depression and paranoia with his family and being estranged from people who love him. And I think this book really at its heart is about the deep friendship between Sebastian and Charles. I really think that is the core meat of this book that holds it all together and makes it worthwhile. And while there have been essays written about a potential gay relationship between Sebastian and Charles, whether that's true or not, it doesn't really matter. What held this book together for me was their feeling of deep trust and mutual understanding of each other. Regardless of whether this was a romantic relationship or not, Charles was often there for Sebastian in the worst periods of his life during his depression or his alcoholism. Charles didn't have any way to fix the situation. He couldn't fix the complex and very deep relationships he had with his family or what had happened in the past. But he tries to be a good friend to Sebastian without abandoning him, even when he's in the deepest, darkest parts of his addiction. And I would say the portrayal of alcoholism in this book is harrowing. Honestly, deeply affected me as a young person about the effects of alcohol and drugs on a trajectory of a young person's life. And I think it's something that's very valuable for a young person to read and contemplate while they're young. And it really showed how addiction is no substitution for facing the challenges of life. Here's a quote with Lady Marchmain while she talks to Charles about Sebastian's addiction. "It's no good, Charles," Lady M said. "All you can mean is that you have not as much influence or knowledge of him as I thought. It's no good either of us trying to believe him. I've known drunkards before. One of the most terrible things about them is their deceit. Love of the truth is the first thing that goes." And so as Sebastian descends further into his alcoholism, he alienates more and more people around him who genuinely care about him. And we unfortunately see someone who's a bright star who burns out a little too brightly in the end. And this book is haunting in a way, sort of in like a nostalgic kind of way, because Charles thinks he can just cut ties with the Flight family and then go on living his life and find a new life. And that will bring him happiness more than these other people he cared about. Let me read you another passage where we think about how Charles feels about Brideshead and about the Flight family in this very good passage where he decides he's going to break up with this family and all of their problems. "As I drove away and turned back in the car to take what promised to be my last view of the house, I felt I was leaving a part of myself behind, and that wherever I went afterwards, I should feel the lack of it, and search for it hopelessly. A door shut, the low door in the wall I had sought and found in Oxford. Open it now, and I should find no enchanted garden." This book is not the longest book, but there are so many passages in this book that speak to me so deeply because it talks about love and unrequited love, about success and failure, about moral pressures and societal pressures to do the right thing, even if you don't think it's the right thing. And also about the difference between being a social outcast and a social success, and that maybe you are happier as an outcast than you ever were as a success. And also this book portrays so well how successful people might have private, desperate lives that none of us would ever want if we were given the choice. In this book, I found deep thoughts about mental health, God, love, social relationships and friendships, and memory and time. This book is deeply dedicated to the pursuit of art and beauty, and yet at the same time is also about the sorrows and deep sorrows that people feel in the pursuit of those things. So I highly recommend this book, and I think you should read it, and I know I will probably read it again and again. I would love to know what you think of this book, even if you hated it. Do you like Brideshead Revisited, or do you wish you had never visited in the first place? Please let me know in the comments below. And while you're here, I would love it if you would smash that like button. Okay, well that's all for going back to Brideshead Revisited. Next time, we will be going to somewhere cutesy and Instagram worthy in E.M. Forrester's A Room with a View. Hope you're having a wonderful week of reading, and as always, stay curious, stay reading.